Hello to everyone. Uh, Good morning or good evening. Welcome to a new session of the webinar called Research Conversation, organized by the Research Department at the Agence française de développement. I am Felipe Correales. I work at the research department of at AFD, focused on inequality issues. And today we are going to present two studies that we have done with researchers of Université de Bordeaux, but as well researchers in Argentina and Ghana, where we have conducted these studies on middle classes. And today we are going to present these studies, doing as well a sort of comparison of the results that we had in these studies. Right now, I will give you some logistic points. At your right side of the screen, you have the chat box where you can send, you can discuss, and you have as well a little box tab questions where you can send the questions for our speakers that we will deal at the end of this webinar. So, with further ado, I will give the floor to Philippe Orliange, who's our executive director in charge of countries at the AFD, for a brief introduction. Philippe, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Gracias, Felipe. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce this week's IFD's Research Conversation Seminar, organized by the Research Department of the French Development Agency, which has been created as a space for discussion on research and analytical work conducted at the agency, jointly with our partners on the respective topics and on issues that are essential for our society today, such as the environmental changes and the societal changes. It is a pleasure for me as executive director in charge of countries to introduce this session, during which studies will be presented on the issue of middle class in Argentina and in Ghana. Studies that have been developed with our partner, Université de Bordeaux, and in close collaboration with academics and researchers from Argentina and Ghana, whom I would like to thank very especially on this occasion. Thank you very much for your involvement and for helping us to further our understanding and socioeconomic analysis of the middle class in these two countries. Let me also take this opportunity to salute Danielle RESNICK, who is a political scientist and currently David Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution and non-resident fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. She will be able to contribute from her perspective and multiple studies on the role of policies that can support the consolidation of a middle class, especially in Africa. I also want to thank all those who participated in these studies and are now part of a new collection of academic papers on the middle classes that we have at IFD. For us as a development agency, as a development bank, it is of great importance to better understand the issue of middle class through research, but through also sharing the conclusions that derive from our operational activities in the countries of relevance for this topic. It is actually not so often that development institutions like ours take an interest on the issue of middle classes. But I think this is absolutely essential for several reasons. One of them being that the SDG agenda adopted in 2015 has sort of given an additional relevance to the issue of middle classes in connection with a number of subjects that have become part of the international agenda, be it urban development, be it the fight against inequalities, be it the issue of climate change. The economic growth of some countries in the last decade, especially China and India, has allowed thousands of people to leave the subsistence economy to become part of the lower middle class. Parts of this progress has been reverted by the COVID pandemic, but this is a fact. And this shows precisely how important it is for development to consolidate and strengthen the middle classes, especially lower middle class, which can be fluctuating in period of crisis such as the COVID pandemic. The challenges in terms of tax policies, social spending, public services, especially education, among others, play a fundamental role in trying to ensure a social link so that countries can move forward on their path to sustainable growth. I should also add that this is extremely relevant from point of view of furthering the foundations of democratic systems, since the interrelation between democracy and middle class is extremely critical. I must say, if I may, from a more sort of personal note, that through my days as director for Latin America in AFD and region director for Brazil and Argentina, from 2017 until 2021, I've had the chance to witness sort of directly the relevance of the issue of middle class, the impact of the pandemic on the Brazilian middle class, the impact of the Argentinian crisis on the Argentinian middle class, and witness the systemic nature of issues in these countries related to the status of middle class. I think it is also interesting to look into this issue because this has a sort of equivalent in terms of conversation in Europe. And this is one of the areas in which what we witness in Europe and what we can witness in Latin America, Africa, and Asia makes the issue of sort of gives to the issue of sort of global relevance. The result of the studies will be presented today, and we hope that these will be useful to all of you. Finally, thank you very much to all the participants for being here today, and thank you very much for our colleagues at AFD from making this possible, and I wish you a very fruitful webinar. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Indeed, it's an important issue. And I will give the floor then to Matthieu and Eric to present us the results, the main results of this interesting research. Matthieu, Eric, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Felipe. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar, and many thanks to Danielle for having accepted to discuss the results of this project. So I am Matthieu CLEMENT from the Bordeaux School of Economics, and with Eric Rougier, also from BSc, we will present the main results of the this AFD project on middle classes in Argentina and Ghana. Perhaps maybe a few words about the context of the project. It's in fact the extension of previous comparative projects already funded by the AFD, and focusing on middle classes in Brazil, Côte d'Ivoire, Turkey, and Vietnam. So we are still working on the valorization of this first project. And this second project on Argentina and Ghana relies on the same empirical design. So as you can see, it was coordinated by a core team here in Bordeaux, but also by two country-specific teams. So I think that Ariel for Argentina and Steven for Ghana are here with us. So as an introduction, I just want to point out some basic facts about the literature on middle classes in developing countries. The rapid extension of developing countries' middle classes is a major event of the early 21st century. This large and potentially heterogeneous group is identified by international organizations, regional development banks, consulting groups as a global middle class. Next slide is possible. And next one, please. Thank you.
Matthieu, you can change the slides with the, I think with the arrows.
Yeah.
Okay. So.
This concept of a global middle class is linked to the idea that the globalization-led growth of the 90s and the 2000s have led to the reduction of poverty and the increase of the intermediate categories. So in line with this idea, there is an optimistic literature showing that high expectations are associated with the expansion of middle classes in developing countries. And based on the experience of northern countries, the development of a large middle class is supposed to sustain global consumption, human capital investment, and economic growth, but also to promote social cohesion, democracy, policy change, as it was emphasized by the modernization theory in the 50s and in the 60s. However, such high expectations have not been fully supported by the empirical literature. In fact, microeconomics evidence, I pointed out the vulnerability of large portions of this middle class in developing countries. And the definition and identification of middle classes remain very controversial in the academic literature. In fact, we were able to identify 4 main approaches. So an economic approach based on income, a more sociological approach based on education and occupation, a subjective approach based on the idea of class consciousness, and finally, a managerial approach based on consumption habits. Oh, sorry. So what is our contribution? Based on 2 case studies, so Argentina and Ghana, the objective of the project was to provide new evidence on the following questions. So who is in the middle, how the middle is specific, and what does the middle aspire to? To answer these questions, we adopt an original empirical strategy that I'm going to present in the next slides. But before that, I just have 2 concluding remarks in this introduction. The first one is that we will try to adopt a comparative and policy-oriented perspective in our presentation. Even so, this comparative perspective was not at the core of the project. And my second comment is that we are fully aware of the limitations of the term of middle class that remain largely debated in the literature. And in this study, we use the term middle class not as a concept, but more as an exploratory tool or reference point that helps describing who exactly falls in the middle of the income distribution in Argentina and Ghana. So this is the outline of the presentation, and I will start with a description of our methodology and materials. In fact, we adopt a 2-step empirical strategy based on the combination of quantitative and qualitative materials. As for the quantitative parts, we use the most comprehensive household surveys in both countries. So the Encuesta Permanente de Hogares in Argentina and the Ghana Living Standard Survey in Ghana. From this data, we adopt a sequential methodology based on 2 steps. First, we identify a middle income group based on the monetary intervals that has been adopted in the literature. For Argentina, our calculations are based on the per capita household income, while in Ghana, we use the per capita household expenditure. Second, we are interested in identifying the internal structure of this middle income group. To do so, we use data on 5 variables describing the educational and occupational characteristics of households belonging to the middle income group, and we carried out a clustering procedure to identify the different subgroups, the different components composing the middle income group. to further investigate the mobility, the behaviors, the aspirations, expectations in terms of public policy of the middle class, we completed the quantitative investigations with qualitative materials. And more specifically, in each country, we carried out a qualitative survey based on semi-structured interviews among 40 households belonging to the middle income group. These 40 households in Ghana and in Argentina were selected to be as representative as possible of the different subgroups that we identified in the quantitative part of the project with the clustering procedure. Moreover, to allow to take into account the potential spatial heterogeneity, in each country we selected two different cities. So the capital city, Buenos Aires and Accra in Argentina and Ghana respectively, and one secondary city, so San Miguel de Tucumán in Argentina and Kumasi in Ghana. We also take into account gender issues, and we try to interview half women in our sample. So based on this qualitative survey, we were able to collect rich information on various dimensions of middle class identity, such as mobility patterns, consumption, education, health, financial behavior, and so on. Only for Argentina, we completed this household qualitative survey with an institutional qualitative survey that can be seen as a kind of third step in our empirical strategy. More precisely, we have conducted interviews with 12 representatives of private and public institutions involved in the implementation of public policies and market strategies. So we have selected these representatives in key sectors such as education, health, consumption, or financial services. For instance, we have carried out an interview with one representative of the Ministry of Labor in Argentina, with one representative from a Coca-Cola company. So if you want, we can show you the list of these representatives during the discussion. Now let me turn to the main results of the project for Argentina. I will here insist on four main findings. The first one is that the middle income group in Argentina is large but fragmented in terms of educational and occupational characteristics. In fact, and as it was done in the literature, we define the middle income group as households with daily per capita income between $10 in purchasing power parity and the 95th percentile of the per capita income distribution. Based on this interval, the middle income group in Argentina accounts for 77%. So it is quite high, but our objective is not to identify precisely the size of the middle income group, but rather to define a large group of households located in the middle of the income distribution. Our qualitative survey also indicates that in Argentina, there is a strong self-identification to the middle class, and that there is a clear perception of upward intergenerational mobility. Then, to look at the internal structure of the middle income group, we apply a clustering procedure based on 5 variables describing the education and occupation of household heads belonging to the middle income group. Based on this clustering procedure, we were able to identify 5 distinct groups among the middle income group in Argentina. So as you can see on this slide, there is one relatively poor group within the middle income group on the left, so the service employees middle class, and we were able to go to the upper middle class composed of groups 4 and 5 on the right side, so the managers, professional employers middle class, and the public employees middle class. So what this structure tells us, in fact, there is a kind of pattern of bipolarization with a clear upper middle class and with more vulnerable components on the left side of the graph. So this fragmentation has already emphasized in the literature, but it is quite pronounced for Argentina. Second main finding, with our qualitative survey, we were able to observe strong aspirational markers of middle-class membership, such as, for instance, the prioritization of education and health, the diversification of consumption, aspirations for home ownership, or search for security, for instance. Such markers tend to homogenize the middle class and can be viewed as part of its social identity. However, the adoption of subsequent behavior in those domains remain highly constrained for the vulnerable components of the middle class. Two important ideas here. First, these vulnerable components remain largely dependent on bad quality public services, especially in education and health. And the richest components of the middle class are able to turn to the market and the private sector to compensate for public services deficiencies, but not the most vulnerable components. Second idea, the vulnerable components of the middle class are obliged to prioritize irreducible expenditures, especially during crisis episodes, and especially during the pandemic and the current inflationary crisis. Third finding, in Argentina, the relationship between the state and the middle class is characterized by a kind of equilibrium between loyalty and strong expectations. Our qualitative survey indicates that all the components of the middle class have a strong attachment to state intervention and public services, even the more liberal and the more pro-market components of this middle class. However, many criticisms and strong expectations in terms of public policies have been expressed. Three expectations are more specifically mentioned here. First, there is unanimous criticisms against the deterioration of public services in education, health, police, justice. Second, all our respondents condemn the endemic corruption in Argentina. And third, they all express strong recriminations against the unfairness of redistribution policies, with the idea that social assistance mainly favor those at the bottom, while the tax system mainly enrich those at the top. Last results I wanted to point out, our institutional interviews for Argentina tend to indicate that public policies do not specifically target the middle class. I will just exemplify this idea by explaining that social assistance does not reach the middle class, but also by emphasizing that deficiencies in public education and health systems. However, some representatives of institutions mentioned a few public programs that benefit to the middle class, at least partially or at least indirectly. For instance, public programs aiming to promote consumption, or programs of microcredit for small businesses, or housing, or programs promoting housing construction. Finally, this institutional survey indicates that while not specifically targeted by public policies, Argentina's middle classes are of great concern for private actors and market strategies. For instance, private institutions in education and health declare targeting specifically the upper components of the middle class. And we also provide evidence of a recent reorientation of market strategies towards the lower components of the middle class, with a few examples drawn from two big companies. For instance, so here, Dia Supermarkets and Coca-Cola. This reorientations echoes the new market-based approach called based or bottom of the pyramid, which puts the emphasis on the increasing purchasing power of consumers in the new middle class, composed of people who have recently escaped from poverty. So I stop there for Argentina, and I give the floor to Eric for the presentation of the main results for Ghana and the discussion of our results from a comparative and policy-oriented perspective.
Thank you, Matthieu. I keep the same outline as Matthieu used for Argentina. So the same progression in the restitution of results. And so for Ghana, the method was the same too, as explained by Matthieu, except that, just to remind you, we could not conduct the institutional survey. So it means that we were just in capacity to comment on the expectations regarding economic policies and public policies that, as they are expressed by the people, the household heads that have been interviewed, but we are not in capacity to say something about the supply of policies. Okay, so this is this is one difference between the two countries, but we have interesting inputs that can be presented nonetheless. So to start with the characteristics of this Ghanaian middle class. First point is to emphasize is that the lower boundary is set at $4. Of course, Ghana is a lower middle income country, so it means that we had to adjust the lower boundary and at lower level than for Argentina. So this is pretty standard in the literature to put the lower boundary at that level. It's slightly above the international poverty line, the World Bank international poverty line set for lower middle income countries, which is $3.20. So it means that here we exclude from our bracket the people that are not poor but still maybe as vulnerable as the poor are. So, and the upper boundary standard is at the 95th percentile. For just to have an equivalent in terms of dollars, it means that we have a slightly below $20 per person per day. Okay, so it means that the bracket is between $4 and $20 for the case of Ghana. So based on this bracket, we have 43% of the population of the. So there is a mistake. This is not urban population. This is the world population. So there are also rural households. So there are 43% of the people living in Ghana that fall into that category of income middle class, I would say. This is pretty large in the African standards. For example, for the study on Côte d'Ivoire, with the same brackets, we had 26% of the population that were classified as middle class in 2015, in the 2015 of the ENV survey, based on this survey. So it means that it's pretty high for West Africa, and the structure of these middle class is also interesting, as evoked by Matthieu in the case of Argentina, but it's the case of all the countries we have investigated. There is the middle class that we find is highly fragmented in terms of socio-economic characteristics. It can be expected, and the cluster analysis produces 5 groups. Okay, there are these groups. So here again, we have this gradient of income, average income, which is reported on the X lines. And here you can see that there are also 5 groups that are, some of them are similar or look like those found for Argentina. This is interesting, given the large gap in terms of GDP per capita between the two countries. For example, the group 3, but here I am anticipating on the comparison. But here we have also a group which is composed of mainly of managerial and professional middle people, workers, majority who are mainly occupied in the public sector. There is also a group of self-employed and small business owners, and a group of salaried workers and craftsmen of the small manufacturing industry and small services, which are massively informally employed. And this group of retirees and inactive, which is mainly made of females, not only, but there is a majority of females in that group with low education, and with also low education and low incomes. And there is this group which is typical of African countries in our classifications, which is the subsistence farmers middle class, which is quite important here, 23% of the world middle class. So this is the main one of the main differences between the structure of the middle class in terms of socioeconomic characteristics between the two countries. There is also a strong polarization of the middle class in a lower and an upper middle class, and between the two dimensions, between the two ends of this middle class, so the lower end and the upper end, there is not that much people, and there are some, but less than in Argentina. It means that it's more polarized, the structure, than in Argentina. And the lower end of the middle class is made of workers and craftsmen, subsistence farmers, and retired and inactive people. They are highly vulnerable, of course. They account for roughly 50% of the world middle class, and they are strongly vulnerable to shocks. And the other end of the middle class, which is the upper end, is made, of course, expectedly of self-employed and expectedly of managers and professionals of Group 3, but more surprisingly of the self-employed and small business owners that of the Group 1, which in Ghana are pretty successful. Those who were classified by the analysis, they are pretty successful in terms of income, and this will be confirmed by the field analysis and the qualitative field analysis. Now let's go to the second point. So in Ghana, there are important markers also of the middle class, and that can be observed, and they are so here we use information based on the qualitative survey. So these markers, they are that people in the middle class, they claim that it's important for them to invest sufficiently in education, to accumulate sufficient wealth for affording legacy to their offspring, and to diversify their consumption. These are very common markers, aspirational markers of the middle class, also in Ghana. But of course, in Ghana, financial constraints are harsher, and they introduce large variations of consumption levels and structure across groups. And for example, here you have figures about the share of income which is devoted to purchasing basic goods and services, and you can see that even for the group 3, which is pretty well off in comparatively speaking, this share is rather high, and of course it's even higher for the two other groups that have lower income. Another interesting point is that of course, the groups that put together the people working or in informal firms or being employed or being self-employed in informal sector, they are of course very vulnerable and very unstable income. And all these people, they generally have very small savings available for paying irreducible expenditures notably during the crisis and the shock, and they feel that they are very vulnerable to this kind of spending. This is pretty similar as what was mentioned for Argentina by Matthieu. So it means that only the upper component of the middle class has real access to a diversified market consumption, in fact. There are also large financial constraints imposed on savings and investment choice or capacities. So all respondents, except in group 4, which are the farmers, they report having access to credit, either bank or mobile, through banks or mobile money, but only the 2 upper segment groups can save formally in terms of their incomes or wealth. So, and they can also invest in notably in landed property or in any sorts of insurance policies, and all including the better off here, group 1 and 3, all reveal that the recent price spikes and the recent crisis has severely harmed their capacities of saving and investing. Another characteristic, strong aspirational characteristic, is the willingness to invest in the education of children. And here also there is this divide between those that can afford private schools, which are of higher quality in terms of programs and teachers, etc., and those who cannot afford them. And of course, for those who cannot afford them, the perspectives of social mobility for their offspring is more limited than for the upper parts of the middle class. This is the same result for the transmission of a legacy in terms of house, in terms of a business, or any form of financial savings. So there is this strong divide between the upper segment and the lower segment of the middle class. And last but not least, the fact that the service reveals that all groups are pretty keen on paying taxes, but provided that these taxes will be properly will transform into effective spending and investment that benefit the whole population when after being perceived. So it means that the people interviewed, they are generally complaining about the poor quality of public infrastructure and the poor quantity also of public infrastructure, and we will see in the next slide that this is a strong expectations that the government increases both the quantity and the quality of this public infrastructure. Last point here, the international upward mobility, I just mentioned here, it is just in the slide below, in the slide just before, sorry, and so I will skip to the last point, which is about political attitude. And in Ghana, what the survey reveals is that they are pretty ambiguous, and notably in the upper segment of the Ghanaian middle class. And so overall, most respondents say that their assessment of the way democracy works on a day-to-day basis is pretty negative. It means that they are very critical about the fact that democracy disregards citizens' views while serving the interest of the very few who have joined the political leaders or the political class. Okay. They also criticize corruption, which is widespread according to them. They also express, and this is especially true of people from the lower segment, but there are also here there is a quotation from people from the upper segment of the middle class. They are also exposed to a growing insecurity, and they attach this insecurity to open migrations, to the economic crisis, but also to the poor institutional response by the government. And they also express their low-level interest, notably media, justice, and police, that their attack as being corrupt and politically aligned and unfair. So now, if we talk about the comparative perspectives and the policy implications of this result, the first thing we need to say is that here the comparison is difficult, as the two contexts are very different, of course. In terms of GDP per capita, Argentina has 4 times the GDP per capita of Ghana. In terms of economic structure, informality is 80% of the employment in Ghana against 15 in Argentina, but also of sectors of activity. Agriculture is massively is very important in Africa, and not unless in Argentina. But also in terms of the social policies that have been rolled out in the two countries, and notably the example of COVID is a good example, with of course a stronger reaction in Argentina than in Ghana, but also in terms of middle class experience, and culture. Argentina is an old middle class country. Ghana is a much newer middle class country. So despite these differences, there are some commonalities that can be emphasized, and maybe it can come as a surprise. One commonality is that there is a similar upper segment in the middle class in the two countries, made of managers and professionals in the public sector, and also from the formal private sector in Argentina. So this component is less relevant for Ghana, where the people in the similar upper segment are mostly public sector workers. And another commonality is that there is a large share of informal workers or workers in informal firms that are included in the middle class in the two countries. And this may come as a surprise for Argentina at the time. Another point of commonalities between the two countries, that in the two countries there is a middle class of retirees, but also a middle class of shopkeepers, between brackets, because all these people who are self-entrepreneurs or small business owners, whether in the informal and formal activities, they weigh a lot in these two national middle classes. Next, let's make a focus on the differences between the two countries, or the similarities in terms of behavior and attitudes, after having spotted the similarities and differences in terms of structures. So in terms of behavior and attitudes, there are lots of similarities, and differences are not that big, in fact. So in both countries, there is a consumption-oriented middle class. The middle class is strongly vulnerable to inflation and to the erosion of their purchasing power, notably in the few past years. In the two countries, there are also lower segments that are vulnerable to social and economic insecurity, and partially due to the importance of the informal sector, and also to the differences in terms of social benefit coverage between the two countries. So there are differences, but by nature there are similar sources of vulnerability in the two sectors. In the two countries, there is also a strong support to I would say theoretical democracy, to the principles of democracy, despite strong disappointment as to how democracy effectively goes. So I will be more specific in the next slide on that if I have time enough. And in the two countries, there is also the common trait that middle class massively reject political and administrative corruption, and also the unfairness of public policies and of tax systems. And okay, I'm just skipping to the next slide, which is one of the last. So in terms of expectations with public policies, here there are contrasts to be made, and I will try to be very short on this. So for Argentina, there are middle classes. They share across the different groups. They share common expectations with public policies. So the income gradients within the middle class is not that important for these expectations. And the first expectation, or the first representation of the middle class Argentina and middle class when referring to these expectations, is that for them, state policies are paramount for all big issues, and these big issues they are pretty well identified by the respondents. So it's equalizing inequalities through most effective fiscal and social policies. It's about reinforcing programs of home or housing ownership. It's about investing in education and healthcare quality to close the gap between the public and private sector. Also, all groups consider that private and public sectors' efforts should be better articulated in such sectors as energy, communication, and environmental regulation. And but there are also some divisions that can be observed, and they are okay. They happen along the line of occupational characteristics mainly. So as Matthieu emphasized, there are pro-market and middle class, and also pro-state middle class, and of course they have different preferences regarding policies. And okay, some of the but there is also difference between the upper middle class and the lower middle class in terms of their expectations with policies. The upper middle class, they are more advocative of policies targeting social policies, targeting the most vulnerable people, but it's mainly for making welfare more transitory for them. So it's the point that had been raised by Matthieu at the beginning of the presentation, this idea that social protection is too comfortable, let's say, for the poor, and should be alleviated by making this poor less vulnerable to other policies, for example, job creation, education, health investment, etc. And on the other side, there is the lower middle class, which insists on policies supporting production, market competition, judicial reform, reform business of the state of the climate of business, and social justice. But they also express conservative demands in terms of security and control of production, of corruption. Sorry. And lastly, I realized that I should have stopped before. Sorry, but we'll the questions on the structure and the questions on the policy expectations, they will be asked together, I guess. So I'm sorry for that. So the last slide is about Ghanaian expectations in terms of policies, and here also you have expectations that are very typical of what we have found in other lower middle income countries in other studies. And one of them is, the first of them is the investment, the need of investment, both in extensive and intensive margins, so new investment and improvement of existing investment or public facilities. The other expectations is to improve agricultural policy so that they can support real farming development. Another expectation is that policies are organized to ease access to energy, and especially in this context of high prices, which is current, and also increase the access to environment health facilities like sanitation, waste management, etc. This is a true demand in the Ghanaian context. Of course, improving social policies for the most vulnerable, and this is something which is kind of different and original from the perspective of what we look at. Is that some respondents in Ghana, and notably in the lower end of the middle class, they say that they consider that Ghana needs more consistency, time consistency in the sequencing or succession of development policies, and that this time consistency tends to be disturbed by the democratic alternance. So this is an interesting point, which kind criticizes the way democracy works and the alternative of democracy of the NPP and the NDC in Ghana, that for these people hinders the consistency of development policies through time. And the last point is that there are also other expectations that are more universally shared and that are common with Argentina that have been expressed in Ghana. And so I will be rapid on them. So put more pro-business reforms, that the government can roll out policies that will increase good job opportunities notably for the youth, reforming institutions, of course, and so put the agenda and the anti-corruption agenda at the forefront, improving tax fairness and the efficiency of public spending, etc. So these are well identified expectations from the middle class. Okay, so I'm close to the end. This is the conclusion. So it's not easy. It was not easy to compare two countries as different, Argentina and Ghana. Still, the middle class, we believe, is a good angle, provides a good angle for doing this, for comparing two countries which are pretty different in terms of many things, income structures, etc., history, and there are findings that have been summed up in this slide, and no need to repeat them. But so there are some commonalities between Argentina and Ghana. Some are surprising, others are less, and there are some specificities that are also worth being identified and commented. And maybe we have a time to discuss about these specificities more in the next part of the seminar. I'm sorry if I didn't stop at the time I was supposed to do. Sorry, Felipe.
Don't worry.
It was a kind of stream, you know what it's
Yeah, no, it's super hard to have these two countries explain the the middle classes and then the comparison. So don't worry about that. And now and thank you very much. Yeah, and now I would like to give the floor to our guest speaker, Danielle RESNICK, who has done a lot of work indeed on these kind of issues, on characterization of these middle classes, on public policies issues, and she has conducted an extensive field work and engaged in policy outreach in multiple countries, several countries as well in Africa, in an African continent. So she has a lot of experience, and I would like to ask her. With your previous work on middle classes in various African countries, what do you see as big difference with the recent findings for Ghana, and how do you see this study that we have conducted?
Okay, well, thanks very much, Felipe, for the introduction and the invitation to be part of this seminar and have the chance to read both of these really interesting papers on Argentina and Ghana. As you alluded to, I have worked on the middle class almost exclusively in Africa. About a decade ago, we had a special journal issue in the Journal of International Development from 2015. We looked at some of these measurement issues using national household surveys from 9 African countries, including Ghana. And then we looked at some in-depth case studies of behaviors and preferences from sources like the World Value Surveys and Afrobarometer. So all this is to say that I have a very deep appreciation of how difficult the topic is, how fascinating it is, and also how important it is to revisit in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what I want to do is really say some of the things I really like about this work, offer some ideas about potential extensions with maybe the current data that you have, and then some other ideas for maybe extending the work either in these countries or in additional countries that AFD may decide to replicate the work, building on the case studies that you've done earlier as well. So overall, I mean, the approach is really interesting because you are combining this quantitative data with the qualitative interviews, and that gives us a much more refined understanding of who these individuals are. What I really like is that the papers examine aspirations, and the field of aspirations research has really taken off in the past few years, but I haven't really seen much scholarship trying to look at aspirations of the middle class. There's a lot on aspirations of the poor. So looking at aspirations of the middle class is really, I think, quite novel. Second, I like this choice of comparisons. As you alluded to, it's not an obvious comparison between Argentina and Ghana, but this is really important to push us to really think about what's globally similar in our discussions of the middle class. And I think you've already been doing this, but there could be ways to parse out more about how the broader economic and political systems in which these classes are embedded affect particularly some of their political views. There's certain, as Eric alluded to, there's certainly been a much broader middle class in Argentina for much longer than in Ghana. And so there may be some interesting country level effects to parse out, especially if you think about different types of party systems or political systems more broadly. So as I mentioned, there's a few things I would have liked to see more of that may be possible with your current data, a few reflections, and then I'll talk briefly about some extensions. So I think first, and I think I'm seeing it in some of the comments coming through as well, is some more reflection on what we might miss by using this approach of income thresholds as the definition of middle class. And then as your approach does, you look at these thresholds and then look at the variety of groups that fit into those thresholds. And I think this came across to me in the Ghana paper. Some of your groups, like Group 4 in Ghana, subsistence farmers, they seem to be in very precarious circumstances to me and more similar to the working poor. I think there's some allusion to, a sizable share not having access to a flush toilet, for instance, or piped water. So are these really middle classes, right? And you're suggesting that the variation, having these 5 different groups, proves that they're middle classes plural. But the counterpart is perhaps you defined the middle class so broadly, and that's why you're seeing so much heterogeneity. So I think at the very least, it may be worthwhile to acknowledge some of the limitations from the income approach, or what you would expect differently if you had used a different approach. A different approach would be to think ex ante, what do we think conceptually constitutes the characteristics of a middle class? What assets would they need, for example? Would they need these basic services as a bottom threshold? You need piped water, you need to be connected to the electricity grid, have a flush toilet, for example, and then seeing where they fall along the income spectrum. So in other words, would some of your middle classes you see in Ghana, would they be recognized as middle class if they went to Argentina, for example? I think that's kind of just a good kind of hypothetical to think about whether we're really defining a global middle class. You both Matthieu and Eric mentioned that there are waves of data, of survey data, and it would be really interesting as part of this work to do more of a longitudinal analysis about these groups. The Ghana paper discusses in the qualitative section the impacts of shocks and crises based on interviews with asking interviewees, their perspectives on different shocks or how their family experienced different shocks. But it would be really interesting to just track, across time with the many different rounds of surveys. Ghana has at least 8 surveys, impacts on these groups, the global financial and food crisis of 2007 to 2009, for example. I know some of these surveys are not panel surveys per se, but this could give some leverage in thinking about what you allude to as stepping stones. Which of these groups, these 5 groups you identified, which ones have grown, which ones have shrunk over time? And that may complement some of your qualitative interviews you have where you look at social mobility, drivers of social mobility. In addition, I thought there may be some value in a little bit more descriptive variation in the categories. There's some reference to gender when looking at female versus male composition of some of these groups. But I was also thinking about age. I was just interviewed today about the ongoing protest among youth in Senegal and how that might be linked to their concerns about social mobility and political voice. And so it'd be really interesting to see kind of age differentiation among these different groups. Where are different age cohorts disproportionately concentrated? Are there notable differences among ethnic groups or different parts of the countries that you look at? And then on your qualitative work, I really love the quotes that were included. I think that they're very vivid, and they give us a much more concrete sense of the issues, the concerns, the priorities of the middle class. But sometimes I've found it a little bit hard for me to fully trust the findings in terms of saying group 2 disproportionately believes this, or group 4 disproportionately believes that, because you're just using one quote to represent an entire category that you measured. So I wondered if there's some way, you can kind of code some of those qualitative responses to show, okay, 40%, of our semi-structured interviews within group 4, for instance, had this particular belief. And then let me just briefly give some suggestions about maybe some further extensions beyond maybe the work that you did, or further kind of thought experiments with this work. One is, I think, on the information on political participation is really important. You both alluded to that. And I think it's important because it's a very contested component of the middle class. There's this famous quote of "no bourgeoisie, no democracy," but we know that really doesn't always hold up. And the rise of military dictatorships in places like Argentina in the 1970s and 1980s, where there was a large middle class, really started to raise doubts about this relationship. So in the research presented here, there's some discussion about voting, but political participation is more than that. So, thinking about how often do these different groups attend community meetings, engage in street protests, engage maybe in social media protests, How often do they contact a politician to complain about poor service delivery? I think engaging in some broader metrics of political participation would be really interesting in this domain. Also, I was curious about the role of the diaspora. There can be very different attitudes for families that may have members who are living overseas. We often see, differences in terms of, who people vote for, if they're in the country or if they're part of the diaspora living overseas. We know Ghana, for instance, has a massive diaspora community. And so, there's a question about whether those who have family members living overseas may be exposed to a broader array of views that might be more cosmopolitan or liberal. And so when we're thinking about the middle class and their views, are there some omitted factors like diaspora connections that may be more responsible for some of the behaviors or views that we see rather than just falling in a particular segment of the income distribution? And then I think finally, one of the issues we often confront in this area of research, and it's one I've confronted many times myself, is whether there really are discrete thresholds and attitudes across classes. So because you're interested in the middle class, you just study the middle class. But it's very possible that the poor or the affluent in these countries might hold similar ideas to the ones that you shared with us today. And because they're not included, particularly in the qualitative interviews, it's always difficult to know what's distinct about the middle class views and behaviors. You're seeing some really interesting differences among your 5 groups. You've seen this heterogeneity even within the group that you've called the middle class. But are these really discrete class differences, or are they merely just continuous income differences in views and behaviors? So I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to talk about policy in the next round of discussion.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Super interesting, all the elements that you mentioned, and we have here as well Gabriele and Stephen who participated in this work. So maybe Stephen, do you want maybe to discuss what are your feelings about like this good perception of what is middle class in Ghana through this kind of study?
Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, please, can you come again?
We can hear you, but we cannot see you. If you can just turn on your camera, that will be perfect. There you go.
Okay. So I was asking for clarification. You were asking me to.
It's just your perception about how this study reveals or is a good methodology to assess what we can understand by middle classes in Ghana, and taking note of what Gabriele said about these elements that we could take into account, and more than, for example, the thresholds that we are using, the attitudes of different population, and if these kind of studies are helping us to understand better, and what can we improve, and from your perspective.
Yes, I think generally because of the parameters we took into account in selecting them. So, for instance, the question about the subsistence farmers, we're also looking at farmers who are owning their own houses and other things that we considered in selecting them. So they own houses, they may be using mobile phone. So there were some other criteria or parameters that we used beyond just being the farmer. So typically, in the Ghanaian context, they will represent some proportion of the middle class per the classification that we have, because we're not just looking at the economic activities they were involved in, but also access to certain things. And then there were questions about whether they have access to electricity and those issues that we explored for all the groups. that way. But I'm intrigued by your last comment, Danielle, about the fact that we did not consider other groups. So to be categorical to say this represents the middle class without having idea about what other classes may also be thinking. Is it unique about the middle class? I was intrigued by that comment. But typically, it represents the pointers of the middle class in Ghana. With the participation, and I think the issue about the continuity in the democracy, I think the concern is that when there's a change in government and another party comes, they more or less abandon the projects that have been started by the previous government, and they have to start their own project going for another loan. So it is when it comes to educational infrastructure, health, and all that, we have abandoned projects that previous government have started, and Ghanaians are not happy. Generally, are not happy about that, and the middle class in particular is very disturbed about some of these things. And there have been some demonstrations and other what they call it, other other actions taken against such behavior of the politician and the corruption and insecurity. So I basically been here in Ghana and then participating in the study with the field work and all that. Um, I think that's the general observation I've made of the typical Ghanaian. And again, if you look at education, those who are highly educated and the fact that they transfer, but in their case, it is not the intergenerational mobility of, I mean, going above their parents in terms of career and all that. It makes it flexible for them to in terms of career path. So it is easier for them to switch jobs because of the kind of education that they have acquired, as against the others with the low education. There's very little flexibility in mobility because of access to resources and all that. So I typically believe that apart from the fact that we also didn't talk to other classes to see whether this actually represents the middle class and not the others. My thinking is that this is a typical representation of the Ghanaian middle class.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I would like to ask Gabriel a little bit the same question. You know, as if this kind of study takes into account a real perspective or a real picture, a nice picture of middle classes of Argentina, and taking note as well of what Daniela said.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Daniel, for your comments. Well, I think for us the most or maybe the one of the most important finding of the study is the new categorization of middle classes, because as you know, it's always very hard to measure middle classes, and in particular in Latin America during the last 20 or 30 years there were a lot of discussion about how to measure middle classes, and in general we stop. Finally, we continue measuring middle classes by their occupation. And that is a problem because we have like an gap between the occupation and sometimes the incomes in different middle class, in particular in public work or public servants. So we think, and I think that idea is shared by my colleagues, that this categorization made by the group, the quantitative categorization, is very useful in order to introduce, not replace, but introduce a new view which can articulate different dimensions. So for that reason, we think that is very interesting. And well, you know, in Argentina in particular, middle class is very intertwined with our national identity, because in our idea, it's like in our narrative, middle class is part of the Argentinian exceptionality in the past. So that I think that the study shows very very nuanced in our study of middle classes, and in particular in Latin America during the commodity boom, there were like an idea of the new middle classes. That meant that the economic reactivation from from 2003 to 2010, then you have like the 5 year of stagnation, and then like a reversion of the improvement of social indicators had not created, had grown new middle class, in particular in Brazil, in particular in Brazil. So after that, there were a lot of discussion about the the support of the new middle classes, which apparently ungrateful middle classes, which began to support the right wing politicians like Bolsonaro. And there are a lot of discussion about what if there were a new middle classes or just the popular sector underwent a good moment of income. So that's a lot of discussion. But I mean that in the center of the current idea of the democracy erosion, the discontent regarding democracy in Latin America, which is a real problem, the idea of the middle class frustration about the stop of upward mobility, it's in the center of our political and academic concerns. And I think that many aspects of the study could um, give new insight about what is happening now in Argentina in particular, but in other Latin American countries. So I think that there are a lot of new findings that can help us to figure out what is happening now with middle classes in our in our country. Sorry, what important question now is the impact of pandemic in political preferences, because not only in Argentina but also in most of Latin American countries, we know a very big differences among who were protected by the state, for example, by conditional cash transfers, which, for example, 25 over 29 Latin American countries developed new or an extension of previous conditional transfer, and for example, the informal sector, which comprise almost half or more of labor workers of labor in Latin American countries, which didn't we didn't we didn't get new conditional transfer, so they suffered the pandemic without protection. So there are new cleavage between different classes, formal and informal, private worker and public workers. So and new cleavage and middle classes are divided by this different experience of the state. And you must know that the tax rate in Latin America, tax burden in Latin America is increasing. So middle classes feel that they pay a lot of taxes and they didn't can't get good services for the taxes. So there are and growing discontent among different middle classes in Latin America. So I think that the study in the case of Argentina show this different aspect of discontent very well. I'm sorry, because the fieldworks were made during the pandemic. Sorry, this is the, the key.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And yeah, indeed, and I see that Roberto Darko, who participated as well in the study, added to Stephen's comment, where he mentioned that Daniel is right in that the qualitative work may not map onto the actual one-to-one on one basis. But however, he says that the quantitative data does reflect what pertains as far as the GLSS is concerned. Uh, yeah, it's super hard, and maybe Matthieu and Eric want to mention something, but we did a super big survey on the qualitative part, but maybe it's an important point to take into account, maybe go further into analysis. But I'm seeing the time, and I don't want to leave the one important issue that we wanted to tackle today, and it's this and as you mentioned, Daniele, the all the political part and the policies that we should take into account or not in order to support this idea of strengthening the middle classes in order to have better democracies. As that's a theory, but how do you see that?
Okay, well, that's a huge topic. I will talk about some policy issues that I think were coming out, ways to support the middle class. And then I think some attitudes we saw of the middle class and what they may mean for policy in other domains. So I think this is really, the policy discussion is where it's really interesting because, we could go back and forth on measurement issues and not really resolve those issues. And the descriptive analysis is intellectually engaging, and it's really rewarding to explore these different nuances. But we have to think about what's the so what message of these exercises. And I think the so what is that if you have a growing or shrinking middle class, what are the implications for government policy? Is this a constituency that pushes for distinct policy outcomes that we really need to start anticipating? And both of these papers really hit on some key issues. And there may be some opportunity to expand the positioning on these issues a bit more. So in Ghana, we saw this group 3 category, this upper middle class, which tends, I think, to be a bit more skewed towards public employees than we even saw in the Argentinian case. And I think this is really key when we think about pension policy, because across Africa, there are countless stories about civil servants enduring months of salary arrears, facing countless bureaucratic challenges in accessing their pensions, learning that their incomes were never remitted to the pension agency. And they wind up in a very insecure financial situation when they ultimately retire. The US Census Bureau actually estimates that by 2050, Africa is going to have the highest absolute number of people over the age of 60. So that's an absolute, not in relative terms. But it's still something to really think about because we talk a lot about African youth, but we need to start actually anticipating issues with aging and noting that there's going to be very high dependency ratios of working populations to support these older populations. So we really need to be thinking about how we can tackle pension systems now before the system becomes more untenable. The authors also pointed to, this informal sector that's part of the middle class, a quite kind of vulnerable middle class, you might say. And I think this is really key because we've seen many governments pursue small-scale loans and grants for informal workers, or pursuing taxation of the informal sector, such as Ghana's e-levy approach. But identifying financially viable ways to actually provide pensions to informal workers, including this vulnerable middle class, is a really underexplored policy area. Likewise, both papers are talking about taxation, and Gabriel was talking about that a little bit more just now. Are there ways to increase earmarking of how money is spent, or just more broadly increasing the transparency, the data about how money is spent? I think the more that citizens are aware of how the data is spent, if they can track the data, the more trust they have in the system, and that's likely to increase tax compliance. So it's a virtuous circle. And this is really critical in places like Ghana and Argentina, because despite being different in so many ways, they both face very high levels of indebtedness at the moment. And both these countries, many others, are undergoing IMF programs that are really pushing for increased revenue mobilization. And so, how do we do this? How do we encourage the middle class to pay more taxes if they don't have trust in how their money is going to be used? And to do that, we really need to be working with revenue agencies, improving the public availability of their data. There's 3 other areas that I thought were quite interesting. One is views on migration policy. I really pulled this out of the Ghana paper. The middle class seemed to be, at least segments of the middle class, and I think this actually tended to be the higher income levels of the middle class, tended to be a bit skeptical about migration, concerned about foreigners coming in. And this contradicts at least my expectations that the middle class may have more liberal views about such issues. It could suggest that as Ghana's middle class grows, there might be potential for backlash against immigrants, much as we've seen in South Africa, off and on over the last decade. And this is a bit worrying given the expectation of internal inflows of migrants into Ghana that can be displaced by ongoing conflicts and climate change in the Sahel, just north of the country. So, what does this intersection of middle class with migration policy mean? On environmental policy, I really liked that the authors engaged on this particular topic. And there were some really interesting interviews about the middle class, how they manage their trash, some of their concerns with pollution. I would be really interested, though, to push a bit further, gauging the middle class's views on what I see as really the quintessential debate at the moment about this trade-off between using natural resources for development versus prioritizing actions to mitigate climate change. And this is really salient in Ghana, for instance, which of course has very abundant natural resources. And so, how do the middle classes sit with regards to that debate? We know we're having that within the broader development community at the moment. And then lastly, there was some discussion, but I think it could be expanded on a bit, on the impacts on health and consumer preferences of an expanding and especially urban middle class. This segment has been found elsewhere to be the largest consumers of ultra-processed foods and the most vulnerable to non-communicable diseases. Ghana's been very susceptible to what's called the triple burden of malnutrition. This is when you have a confluence of, you have populations that face stunting, you have others with micronutrient deficiencies, and then you have others suffering obesity. And so, in the Argentinian case, there were some quotes that were pulled out, about how interviewees were a bit upset, noting their chagrin that they had to cut back consumption of Coca-Cola or eating fried foods during economic downturns. And so there could be some really interesting explorations on the middle class's different types of support for public policies to improve nutrition, things like sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, greater regulations on food companies, including rules on labeling and advertising to children. And this may be something that could be particularly teased out in the Argentinian case, because you noted you did this institutional survey as well with certain corporations, including corporations like Coca-Cola. So in other words, I think some of the future work on policy could identify perhaps particular policy debates that are ongoing in each country, and then try to come up with some typology about middle class preferences on these issues. You could even think about some interesting clusters around middle class views about state versus market, individualism versus communitarianism, or even nationalism versus globalism, especially if we reflect on Gabriel's intervention just now about the links between even the middle classes and populism and kind of nationalism. So let me leave it there and turn back to you, Felipe.
Thank you very much, Daniele. And I see that Robert is with us. I don't know, Robert, if you want to give us your insights.
Sorry. Well, thank you very much. I think a lot has been said, and again, very interesting dimensions of a topic that I think is very interesting, but also very relevant, particularly because of who the middle class is in the process of development generally. And so I think that, and for many of us, and I saw in the chat that people were asking why there was this comparison between Ghana and Argentina. I think, of course, sometimes when you do compare countries that are different in a way on a particular issue, it gives you a broader dimension of things that one needs to reflect on in respect of a particular issue. One of the things that I think, again, it came up earlier in the discussion, which I probably will just quickly touch on, is the issue of the fluidity of the middle class, particularly for countries like Ghana. And you'd find that that fluidity is particularly acute for the lower end of the middle class. And so you have all these classes, such as the farmers, that are part of the middle class, and it generally also reflects on the fact that average incomes are still quite low in Ghana. And so if you take in the 95th percentile, even the median income is generally not too high. So if you take the 5th percentile versus the 95th percentile, clearly for the lower end, you'll find that there are a lot of households that you would typically consider as vulnerable households. Okay, and it's reflecting in the data. I think one more issue that I wanted to touch on, which Danielle talked about, is this issue about the intersection between the middle class and the migration, and the fact that there were some sentiments that were expressed, particularly among some of the middle class people. I think one of the issues and possible explanations has to do with political patronage and the fact that they see some of the migrants getting away with many things which typically the Ghanaian wouldn't get away with. And this actually also has an intersection with the mining issues and issues bordering on the environmental degradation that has happened over the last few years and has again been a feature in the public policy discourse. The fact that you are finding some foreign nationals that are heavily involved in degradation to an extent that locals cannot get that kind of leverage. And so again, it's sentiments that are being pushed by the middle class because essentially they are the agents or the voices of the people, if you like. And that is why it seems to be coming up, again, being picked up in this study. But again, it's super exciting issue. There are different dimensions that, but I know we are all constrained with time. But maybe a quick one. On this issue about the impact on health and then consumer preferences, that again Danielle mentioned. You know, the challenge that the growing middle class has to do with perception and how these perceptions influence the preference set of the so-called middle class, and how that also translates into behavior in a way that then will impact adversely on health. And so there is a perception, for instance, that if you are middle class, you must be able to have, your children must be able to eat ice cream and they must be able to watch TV all day, etc., without exercising. So you tend to find that the lower middle class people, again, translate these perceptions into changing preferences in a way that is then adverse for health outcomes. Again, so these are, again, very interesting issues that I think that we certainly will be exploring some more. As I did mention in the chat, ISSER is very interested in learning about the dynamics of this middle income groups over time. And it's some of the things that going forward we have as our research agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I would like to go back to Gabriel. Maybe Gabriel, you have some final comments on this political issue.
Well, I think that sorry, my microphone.
We can hear you.
There's a problem with my microphone. Sorry,
we can hear you.
What I want to point out two points. One linked to migration. for us in Latin America, there is a big. Okay, you can or can't? No,
Yes, yes.
you can hear me or not? No.
Yeah, yes,
Yes,
yes.
I hear you.
I think he has problems with his connection.
We can hear you.
He has been kicked out, I guess, for the bad connection. But I don't know if Steven, if you have some comments, or Matthieu or Eric, if you want to comment. Maybe Eric, Matthieu on the Argentinian side, if you want to say something.
I mean, just briefly also on the migration. I think the other side is um, the fact of this ECOWAS policy that some Ghanaians believe foreigners are taking the petty trading business from them. So more like they see them as a threat, collapsing their businesses and all that. So that is also another reason that explains why we have that kind of deviation from the norm. And that's and I also believe that the informal sector thing must also be looked at very critically because it is increasing, expanding, and we are building a lot of middle class from there, especially those in businesses and all that. But when it comes to social protection, very little for pensions and all that. We don't have, even though the pensions scheme in Ghana makes provision for the informal sector to make their personal contribution, but it doesn't seem to be very common. Awareness is low, and even the point of payment and all that is still very critical to do. That, but the middle class is actually increased. The informal sector uh, of the middle class is actually increasing, and we need a policy direction in that area in supporting. So I agree to that. But again, also the taxation, as it is said, I mean, seen in the data. I mean, people are willing, but the thing is that what do they see the especially politicians using the money for? So if there's some transparency and there's some trust, which for now it doesn't seem to be common features among the middle class. If we instill this kind of trust and transparency in the administration of resources, then middle class will also be willing to pay, as they have demonstrated in their responses. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Matthieu, I don't know if I don't see Gabriele connected. Would you like to say something about your perspective on the political side in Argentina, and maybe we can close with that?
First of all, thank you very much, Daniel, for your suggestions and very, very relevant many aspects.
She's giving us more work.
Yeah. Yeah. On the link between middle classes and migration, on the political commitment on health policies. This is an issue that is very important in my research on the link between social stratification and obesity pandemic and so on. So thank you very much. Yeah, among all your suggestions on the policy side, I, I think that for Argentina, the two most important are redistribution policies, so pensions and, of course, taxation. And I think that in the report on Argentina, we develop a lot these aspects because, as I told in the presentation, the perception of redistribution policies that are seen by all middle class respondents as very unfair is a crucial issue. And this is linked to your point about how to ask to the middle class to pay more taxes if they don't trust in government and in the state. So this is the first issue, so the issue of redistribution policies and health policies. And I think that, yeah, Gabriel would explain it better than me, but the issue of nationalism versus globalism is another important issue in Argentina, and in line with the migration issue, because there are some migration waves in Argentina from Venezuela, especially, and so there is a lot of debates around the issue of nationalism, how to deal with migrants, and there is a kind of development of some forms of radicalism in some part of the middle class, and it's a really an avenue for research, very interesting.
Thank you very much, Matthieu. And I would add to that it will be super interesting as well. And we have, as you said, Daniele, some questions about how middle classes are dealing with trash, pollution, etc. But for us at AFD, one of our strategies and our big objective is to analyze better how the climate change will impact all these populations, and that will be as well an interesting point to dig a lot more that we have done so far. So thank you very much, Daniele, for your comments. Super interesting. Thank you very much, Robert, Stephen, for your comments as well. Robert for joining and giving such interesting comments. Stephen as well. Unfortunately, we lost Gabriel. And thank you very much, Eric and Matthieu as well for your work and for being here to present the study. Thank you very much, and thank you all the audience as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank Daniel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.